Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glendavid Books. My guest today is a former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, but at the moment he's Managing Director of the London-based Overseas Development Institute. Earlier this month he wrote an article for the Business Standard which is a searing indictment of the Indian system, its institutions and the people who man them, and the Indian people. Rarely, if ever, will you come across a critique that is so courageous, so bold and so forthright. Joining me now to talk about his views is Rathin Roy. Dr. Roy, as I said in that introduction, your article for the Business Standard is a searing indictment of the Indian system, its institutions and the people who man them, as well as the Indian people. And later in this interview, I want to explore your thinking on all three counts. But in fact, that Business Standard article begins with a pity-forward description of the state of the economy. You write, "The picture is grim." Why don't you start by telling me why you think it's grim?
Thank you, Karan, and thank you for your kind words. I just want to tell your audience that I include myself in that indictment. It is an indictment on all of us, and especially those of us who are fortunate enough to have, the privilege of education and ability to influence affairs in howsoever small a measure. The Indian economy is today smaller, considerably smaller than it was when COVID happened. 3 years before COVID happened, it began to decelerate, which means it was growing but not growing as fast. 2019, when COVID hit us, the economy began to shrink, which means today the Indian economy produces fewer goods and services than it did in 2019. That means in 2020 March, when COVID broke. That means for more than a year now, our economy has been smaller than it was 18 months ago. When an economy is smaller, then it requires less of things to produce goods and services. So it requires less of labor, which means fewer people are employed. It requires less of capital, which means capital is underutilized. And that is grim unless you do something about it.
That's what I want to come to. How do you view the steps the government has taken? The government claims it's done a lot and it's done it periodically when required. So how do you view the steps the government has taken? Are they the right ones to tackle what everyone believes is the major problem, a collapse in demand and a collapse in consumer sentiment?
But that's unfortunate. I wish that were the only major problem. There is one more problem, which is employment has gone down. People are getting paid less. Your bank money is earning you less interest because interest rates have come down. But India is going through a profit-led recovery, which means profits are going up. The top 80% of listed companies in this country, I'm being very optimistic here, are making money like never before by selling less. So not just are we producing less, but some people are making more money from producing less.
So then we have three critical problems: a collapse in demand, a collapse in consumption, and a collapse in employment. Has the steps the government has taken look to you to be adequate for tackling those three problems?
But clearly not, otherwise we wouldn't be where we are today, which is with a smaller economy and a profit-led recovery, no?
Let me push that a little further. Are they simply not sufficiently far enough in the right direction, or are they actually the wrong measures altogether?
They are insufficient. They are ill thought out, and they have no coherent, joined up impact on the economy. Something happens one day, something happens the next. Let's start by acknowledging two things about the government of India. One, it has for a long time now been extremely constrained in its ability to spend money because it hasn't been collecting enough taxes. With the pandemic, it collected even fewer taxes because profits went down, but because economic activity went down. But when profits went up, it is only now that you are seeing corporate profit taxes recovering. So something went wrong from the time the pandemic hit and the time people made profits and the ability of the government to collect money. A resource-constrained government would therefore have to spend its money in a well-planned, joined-up fashion, or to borrow. The government did neither. It neither spent money in a well-planned, joined-up fashion, nor did it borrow at the scale that would allow it to more than overcome shortfalls in tax revenue and the kind of big spending that you have seen in many, many other economies that has tempered the economic shock. As of this quarter, the economy of the United States, after China, is as large as it was when COVID struck. As of the next 2 quarters, this will be true of most economies across Europe, and probably by early next year, it will be true of most economies in the G20. It will not be true of India.
Just to sum up what you said, I'm quoting your words. What the government has done is insufficient, ill thought out, not properly coordinated, and as a result, after the next 1 or 2 quarters, all the major economies of Europe will be larger than they were before COVID, but for the Indian economy, which will still be below COVID, pre-COVID levels.
All the major G20 economies, not just Europe, yes.
So we will be the unique, different one.
Not unique, but we will be in a small minority of countries. I can't say exactly what will happen, for instance, in Indonesia.
But this is a sign and an indication of the extent to which the government's recipe for putting the economy back on its feet was the wrong one.
If the government had a recipe, it was certainly in the kitchen. I'm not sure they had a recipe.
In other words, they didn't even know what they were doing. They didn't have a plan.
It is almost certain that they didn't have a plan. They probably knew what they were doing, but nowhere with the kind of clarity that the Home Ministry has in what it has been doing over the last 2 years. I didn't see that clarity in economic policy.
If they had a plan, it wasn't executed, but you actually think they didn't have a plan, and certainly whatever they were doing, whether with or without a plan, wasn't properly executed. There was no clarity behind it.
Yes.
So insufficient, ill thought out, badly coordinated, and now it seems not actually thought out at all and not properly executed.
We are still talking about the economy and not the government's COVID policy, right?
We're talking about the economy, yes.
Very well, because there are some interesting parallels between the two, but you're absolutely right.
So what I'm putting to you is yet another searing indictment of the government. This is not, to be honest, a major part of that article you wrote. I'll come to your article in a moment's time. But what you've now made clear is that the government's response to the COVID-induced crisis that the economy is still going through was insufficient, illogical, not properly coordinated, not thought through, badly executed, lacking in clarity. And you also said you probably think they didn't know what they were doing.
Well, I don't know whether they knew what they were doing, but if they did know what they were doing, they certainly didn't do it, if you see what I mean.
And certainly they didn't convey to the country, or to you at any rate, that they know what they're doing.
They didn't convey that to me. I don't know if they did to the electorate. Good luck to them.
Let me then put this to you. If you were today the Prime Minister's economic advisor or a member of that important body, what would you have suggested the government should do? What is it that they haven't done, which should have been done, and would have improved the situation?
Where do I begin? Well, let us try and refine that question to say that if I had the opportunity to sort of influence how things are done from today, to clean up the mess, in other words, the mess of the last 18 months, then the first thing we would need to start doing is acknowledge that because we have a profit-led recovery, macroeconomic policy, which is fiscal policy, monetary policy, exchange rate policy, employment policy, must ensure an increase in the number of people getting hired and at reasonable wages.
How?
We need a wage recovery. That can happen in 3 or 4 ways. It can happen through a process of announcing structural changes. I've been through that before in your program.
No, repeat it again because audiences won't remember.
Okay.
But pithily.
Pithily, the Indian economy is not going to export its way out of trouble. It is going to have to sell goods and services to its own people, for which they will need to have money in their pockets. But if you're only going to sell goods and services to relatively rich people, then you're not going to be able to get enough money into the pockets of the vast majority of Indians for demand to rise for the economy to recover.
So are you saying we need greater income support for those at the bottom of the pyramid?
We need greater income support for those at the bottom, and we need to change the output composition of what we are producing. We need to import fewer 400 rupee shirts and make them at home, not just make 2,000 rupee shirts.
But can you do this as an immediate response to the crisis you face today? This sounds to me...
The time for an immediate response is over. We have to pick up the pieces. And at the beginning of the crisis, I was saying that we have to treat this crisis as a war. That would have been the right time for massive income support. We could then have had the luxury of making a less painful structural transition in the economy.
But that we didn't do.
That luxury is gone. We will have to now we have a very clear choice before us. We can either now decline at an even faster rate than before into what I have described on this program as one of the unsuccessful development transformations in the world.
Or
we can make the painful structural transformation that I'm saying.
But you're saying something very interesting, and I'm deliberately interrupting you to underline this for the audience. Gone is the moment for an immediate income support and an immediate package that would help recover the economy. That was 18 months ago. It's over. We didn't do it when we should have. We now, therefore, are in a worse position. Now, the way out of the hole we've collapsed into is fairly widespread structural reconstruction of the economy. So don't look at short-term immediate measures. The time for that is over. We now have to look at the much deeper, more difficult structural reconstruction, because only when that happens will we get out of this hole we've gone into.
Precisely, and I want to here draw a very clear line between the use of the word reforms in this context and the word you used, which was structural change.
You're talking of structural change.
I'm talking about structural change. Reforming this law or that law is necessary and important, but by no means sufficient.
Then explain to the audience what are the top 3 things, and limit yourself just to 3, that need to be done to ensure that structural reconstruction starts happening now.
Use the fact that the government is the largest landowner to use the land at the government's disposal to create a massive, I would say 10 times of today's scale, public residential housing program, where the land is subsidized but nothing else is, and 400 to 500 million people in India can buy 5 to 10 lakh rupee houses and own them.
Is this with the public-private partnership bringing in private builders? Or
Absolutely.
the government doing it on its own?
Bringing in private builders to build houses at a 15% rate of return and then to sell them. That's it.
The government in the last budget actually identified selling of excess land as an asset to boost government revenue. You're saying don't sell it, use it to build 400 to 500 million houses for the poor.
There's enough land for the government to do both.
Okay. What's the second step of this structural reconstruction?
Start asking why we import shirts that cost 400 and 300 rupees from Bangladesh and Vietnam, while we make 2,000 rupee shirts like this in India.
But beyond asking that question, what do you do?
Well, obviously you have to produce them, but for that you have to ask why we don't produce them. That in it, I think I've elaborated on this in the past, but I can do so again.
Please do quickly.
We don't produce them because we produce expensive shirts with high-cost labor and highly capital-intensive equipment in the west and south of India. We could produce these 400 rupee shirts with much cheaper labor in the north and east of India, but we are unable to set up the infrastructure or the industry in the north and east of India.
So what you're saying is that actually move your investment to the north and the east, where you can produce cheaper shirts because the labor is cheaper.
Don't move your labor from the north and the east to the south. Move your capital from the south and the west to the north and the east. Yes, absolutely.
How easily is this done? Your first step, which was to use excess government land to build 400 or 500 million houses, could be done fairly quickly because there is the private sector there to support it. You don't need too much pre-investment. The second step actually is a long process of moving investment from the south to the northeast or to the east. That requires a whole set of policy changes. So can the second step be done quickly?
No, but it can be commenced very quickly. There are several low-hanging fruits you can get.
Such as?
Such as setting up textile industries where they used to be once and they have disappeared now.
When you say set up, who's going to set it up?
The private sector has to be brought in there.
Do you not have to give them incentives to do so?
Well, then you have to ask why they're not coming there on their own, because labor is cheaper there.
But when you ask that, you'll have the answer to give them the incentives, won't you?
Well, but I still would need to know why they're not coming.
But what I'm pointing out is that whereas the first step could be done fairly quickly,
yes,
the second is a process that's going to take 6, 7, 8 months, maybe longer.
So will the first, actually. It's not that easy to build housing. But so once you signal intent, so if you signal intent that you're going to build, let's say, 1 million to 2 million houses in various class 2 and class 3 towns of India, then the cement manufacturers, the steel manufacturers that are going to service those houses will gear up in their investments.
Okay.
That will boost the economy. The same is true for 400 rupee shirt.
The first 2 steps of your major structural reconstruction that is essential if we're going to get out of the hole we've fallen into is something that's going to take anywhere between 6 months to a year. It's not going to happen overnight. The government has to start working on it, but it will take up to a year. What's the third step?
The government has to work on it and the private sector has to work on it. The third step, I'm afraid, is a little more complex and societal. Health and education are important parts of any developing country's transformation. People often talk about the Chinese transformation. They forget that China has seen a revolution in the quality and magnitude and extent of its education at all levels of education. The Chinese today are far better educated at all levels than Indians are. We are not. We need to fix that. That is employment intensive, and that will also equip the country with the human capital necessary to diversify output. That's going to take much longer.
There's no doubt this is a crying need, but it's going to take a couple of years at least, at the minimum, to happen. So then what you're suggesting, when I look back at the 3 steps that you think are essential for the major reconstruction, you're suggesting a process that will take a year or 2 or 3. In other words, we're not getting out of this hole in a hurry.
You are not. Just like a country which has fought a war badly and has therefore suffered structural damage internally, has to then knuckle down for the long haul and reconstruct the economy, like Germany and Japan did after the Second World War.
In other words, there's a long haul back. It's a long, high hill we have to climb, and as yet, we don't know whether the government is willing to even start the climb.
Or else we can join the long list of unsuccessful countries at the bottom of that hill. Absolutely.
So that's the alternative. Either we start the trudge up the hill, which will take 2-3 years, it won't be easy, or if we don't, we'll join the long list of countries stuck at the bottom of the hill, perhaps additionally sliding down, because we have a huge population as well.
Possibly, yes. But yes, in gist, that is it.
And the important thing you said, I'm just repeating it, gone is the time for immediate steps for immediate recovery. That was possible 18 months ago, not today. Now, major, painful, fairly middle to long-term reconstruction is the only solution to the economic crisis.
Yes.
You're nodding yes, but that means yes?
That does mean yes. We are not going to go back to the world we were in 2018 or even in 2008. If we are going to, prosper, we are going to be a very different country when we were at either of these times, a more inclusive country and a country with a much broader demand and productive base than this country has seen since 1990.
My last question before I come back to what I call the searing critique in your Business Standard article, and that's this. Does the government have any idea of the sort of challenge it faces? You, from time to time, meet and talk to people connected at some level with the government. Do they have any idea of the sense of the challenge they face?
I haven't spoken to anyone thanks to COVID and my getting it for a very long time.
So you just don't know whether they understand what you're talking about and are in agreement with it or not?
If the best way to comprehend the intentions and actions of government is to read what the government is doing. And on that count, I am not persuaded that they comprehend the nature or extent or magnitude of this.
In other words, the government is either willfully or blissfully ignorant of the challenge they face, because if they were aware of it, they talk about it, and the fact that they don't talk about it suggests they're not even aware of it.
It won't be the first government in the history of the world to be in this situation, and certainly not the last, but I suspect you're right.
All right, against this background, and I'll point out for the audience that it's bleak verging on black, but that's the economic background. Let's come to what you say about what I call the searing indictment. And I want to begin by pointing out that this is what you say about how the government has responded to the economic crisis. To this terrible state of affairs, it has responded with the pusillanimity that marks effete societies. I take it that's a direct criticism of the government and very possibly of the finance minister personally.
No, I think the finance minister, under the larger constraints that I've tried to point out in that article, has personally not done a bad job at all. But she's constrained by the circumstances she finds herself.
Whose pusillanimity are you talking about?
The system.
The system. Now, hang on. The system exists of people. Identify the people that make the system happen. Change the people and change their attitudes. The system changes.
But
so come back to the people that behind this phrase. Who are the people behind this phrase?
The system is not the entertainment industry. It is a series of processes in which people participate. They can influence the direction of that system.
No. Don't cop out of identifying the people, because that's what people who are...
But I do not accept what you're saying. I do not think that it is the people as such. The people are an outcome of what the system demands. And what the system
demands... So when
you
say in your article that India has responded to this terrible state of affairs with the pusillanimity that marks effete societies, you're not talking about people, you're not talking about ministry, you're not talking about government, you're talking about the system in the abstract.
I would have used the words people or government, individuals or government if I did. I used the word society.
All right. Let me then see if I can get you to give me a more direct answer to the next question. There is a sentence in that article which is very clearly about the Prime Minister himself, even though you don't name him. I'm going to read it out to you. Politicians pursue Twitter, indulge their sartorial affectations and pogonotrophy, and trade vulgar election rhetoric, oblivious to the unfolding tragic reversal of India's aspirational story. That's about the Prime Minister, isn't it?
It's about most politicians in this country, it would be more productive for me to name exceptions.
Come.
Pornography is not a prime ministerial monopoly, as I recall the leader of the opposition.
Dr. Roy, when you wrote this article,
yes,
and it was early July,
yes,
politicians pursue Twitter, that's the Prime Minister, indulge their sartorial affectations and pornography, that is clearly the Prime Minister. And I'll say for the sake of the audience, pornography is in fact the art of cultivating a beard.
yes.
And then you say, trade vulgar election rhetoric. Didi oh Didi comes to mind. Oblivious of the unfolding tragic reversal of India's aspirational story. You really say to me that's not the Prime Minister you're talking about?
The beauty about writing an article about a collective is that people are free to draw conclusions about that with respect to individuals. But it does certainly, that description, I'll say this much, does not exclude the Prime Minister.
You know, I began this and I introduced you by saying that rarely does one come across such forthright boldness and such courage. It suddenly seems when I'm asking you to identify the people you're talking about, you're backing away from those qualities.
If courage is more than identifying people, I'm afraid, it is, and I don't know if I'm courageous, but it is more about a system in which people are culpable. Obviously, people who are in power are culpable far more than people who happen not to be in power.
No. You're eliding out of it by once again falling back on abstractions, and I won't permit you to do that. Don't philosophize your sentence. I'm asking you to pinpoint it in terms of the person in mind. Look,
I don't write, think, or act based on individual personalities.
Now, hang on a second. Politicians pursue Twitter,
yes,
indulge their sartorial affectations and pornography, and trade vulgar election rhetoric oblivious to the unfolding tragic reversal of India's aspirational story. And you're seriously telling me the Prime Minister is not the image you had in mind when you wrote those words?
No, certainly I had no individual image in mind. This is a political class. But as I said to you already, I do not exclude the Prime Minister from this comment. There are others with beards in this country. There are others who trade vulgar political rhetoric. So I think it is convenient to blame it all on the Prime Minister, but I wish the political class were made of sterner stuff. It is not.
Suddenly you don't sound as bold and brave and courageous as you did when
because
I
I'm not in the business of criticizing individuals. And if that is a mark of courage, I'm happy not to wear that badge.
Let me put it like this. Let's for a moment forget who you had in mind, whether it was the Prime Minister or a system.
I just told you I had no one in mind individually.
It's a description that's so accurate to the Prime Minister that it's hard to believe, but leave that aside. What you're saying there is that the system or the government is guilty of two things. India's aspiration has hit a wall, and either the system or the government doesn't recognize it or won't respond to it. That clearly is being said.
Absolutely. I'm saying that. I'm saying the government, the system is effete. And that is a consequence of an effeteness that has entered Indian society. That actually Prime Minister Nehru described very well.
Let's not go into Nehru, let's stick to Modi. The government is Modi's government, and you're saying Modi's government has followed policies as a result of which India's aspirations have hit a wall?
Yes, the government of the day has.
And therefore, that hitting of the wall of our aspirations is a result of the policies Modi's government followed.
I would be, if I wanted to be kind, I would say,
don't be kind, be truthful.
No, there's no truth or false here. These are opinions. If I had to be kind, I'd say the government has done absolutely nothing to reverse our march towards this aspirational wall. It is, I've argued this.
So is the government responsible for the fact that our aspirations have hit a wall?
All governments that have...
Is this government responsible?
For our aspirations? Whose aspirations?
India's aspirations.
Mr. Ambani's?
Oh, India's.
What is India, Mr. Ambani?
Just a moment. You talked here of the reversal of India's aspirational story. What did you mean when you wrote that? Those are your phrases.
Yes.
So is our government, the Modi government, responsible for India's aspirational story hitting a wall?
Reversing. Yes.
It is.
Reversing.
The Modi government is responsible.
The Modi government is culpable in India's aspirational story reversing.
You prefer the word culpable to responsible?
I do, because the Modi government could have acted not to have this reversal happen, but it did not. To give it responsibility would be giving it far too much credit. I wouldn't give any government that.
You're playing with words, but that's your prerogative. You seem to make an art of that, but never mind. The second question.
I choose my words carefully, yes.
Is the government acknowledging what's happened, or is it in denial?
Certainly not.
Is it in denial?
I don't know what they privately think, but again, if I go by their public statements, if I go by what they acknowledge and they do not, but if I go by how they're acting, completely. Not in denial, I mean even worse. they seem to show complete lack of awareness that such a situation even exists.
Okay. Let's then come to what you've written in that Business Standard article about institutions, and let's see whether you stand by what you wrote, or once again, you're going to find an artful, clever way of
I can be more specific about institutions, they're not people.
You say of Niti Aayog. Niti Aayog seems to have appropriated the role of court jester.
Unquestionably.
Unquestionably, Niti Aayog is a court jester.
Has appropriated the role of a court jester, yes.
When you appropriate that role, you actually become a court jester.
No, you actually ask for it, it's even worse.
And you then go on to say, it has an opinion on everything, but a solution for nothing.
Yes.
What brings you to that conclusion?
Let me ask you, you read the papers, or anyone.
Don't ask me questions in answer to my question. Tell me, why do you think it's become a court jester?
Because I just told you in that article, because they have a solution for nothing.
But why do you say that?
Because they have a solution for nothing. I was going to ask you that. Name one solution they've come up with. I can't. Therefore, I think they have a solution for nothing. But an opinion on everything. On startups, on the pandemic, on lockdowns, on masking, on privatization, on disinvestment. Lots of opinions. On artificial intelligence, God bless me.
In layman's language, does this mean that Niti Aayog keeps talking about every subject under the sun, but doesn't know what to do and doesn't know what to suggest?
I don't know about no, but it doesn't do anything and certainly doesn't suggest anything that is concrete. Let me give you an example.
So it's all rhetoric and all talk and no action.
Let me give you an example. 3 or 5 years ago, I wrote an article which quite upset the vice chairman, where I said that the Niti Aayog had produced something called a medium-term strategy, which was empty in content and ridiculous in form. They don't even remember their own strategy anymore that they produced 3 years ago. Where is that strategy? It was supposed to be a medium-term strategy. It doesn't exist anymore. If that is not having an opinion on everything for its own sake and acting on nothing, I don't know what is.
Okay. Let's come to the Reserve Bank of India. You write, it produces jargon-filled, analytically empty quarterly statements about the likelihood of inflation going up or down that have ceased to matter for the trajectory of inflation in India. Are you saying the RBI statements have become irrelevant?
Yes, I am saying that. I am saying that because if you make a statement in which you say that inflation could either go up or go down,
and sometimes both together,
yes, then I don't see how I could possibly ascribe any relevance to a statement made like this by any central bank.
Is this because it's being careful, cautious in covering itself? Or is it because it lacks proper analytical thinking, because it doesn't have the sort of people it needs to do that thinking?
I don't know. Again, I don't know. What I do know is not doing its job.
It's failing?
It is not doing its job.
Does that mean failing?
It is not doing its job.
But hang on.
You can try and do your job and fail. You can try and do your job and succeed. You cannot do your job. It is worse than failing. It is not doing its job. Its job is to have a coherent narrative on what inflation is going to be and how to manage it. It is not doing so.
In fact, as you said, it's not doing its job. That's worse than failing.
Yes.
Your words.
Yes. That is being effete. That is being abdicating responsibility. Not doing your job is what the late Mughals did. They did not do their job, and we know what happened.
How far back does this problem with the RBI go?
I think it's very recent.
Will you say very recent under the present RBI governor?
I don't comment on people, but I'd say the RBI as an institution
Don't comment on people, put a year on it then.
No, I'd say the last 3 or 4 years.
That means the last 2 governors.
I don't know about
Most people would say that means since the departure of Raghuram Rajan, whether you say it in those terms or not.
I'm not going to comment on individual persons.
I'm not asking you to comment on individual persons. I'm asking you to date the time the problem began. Last 2-3 years.
I don't date people by gubernatorial.
I'm not asking you to date people. I'm asking you to date the problem.
The problem, I said 3 or 4 years, yes.
That means since Raghuram Rajan left.
I don't know. Possibly 5, possibly 3 or 4.
Once again, you're back to playing games.
No, I will not correlate people's individual tenures of office with institutional failure. It's far too important.
I'm beginning to think that description at the beginning of the interview of boldness, forthrightness and courage may have been a bit of an exaggeration.
If you thought it was about people naming, then I'm sure it was.
It wasn't about people naming. It was about what you wrote.
If we are going to talk about the institution, I will say that the Reserve Bank of India as an institution has increasingly not done its job over the last 3 or 4 years. Whether the governor is responsible or a chief general manager or the Ministry of Finance, which oversees the Reserve Bank, is a deeper question.
Okay.
Right?
But the important thing is, you said, it has not done its job.
Yes.
And as you said, that is worse than failing.
It is.
Let's now come to what you say about the Finance Ministry, because it seems to me you have 2 very sharply critical comments about them in that Business Standard article. First, you say it's bureaucracy. is so breathtakingly incapable of executing the task of disinvestment that the government has substantially missed its disinvestment targets for 5 consecutive years. Now, that's a fact. No one can deny it. The question is, you're blaming the Babus. Many others would say the problem actually lies with finance ministers and prime ministers who blithely make promises, even in budgets, with no intention of fulfilling them. Babus only carry the can for the fact that ministers make promises without intending to fulfill them. Why are you blaming the ministry and not the minister?
Yes, that's a good question. I think it's a very important question. Let me clarify this. The reason why India has failed to disinvest effectively has been primarily due to lack of administrative, executive and technical competence, not because of lack of intent. I don't have time to go into this.
What about lack of political will?
Political will is there. Let me give you 2 examples. Political will is that I accept in principle that I must privatize the life insurance corporation. Let me finish. It takes me 14 months to appoint an advisor from the markets to kickstart this process. That's not lack of political will.
Oh, hang on, it is. I'll tell you why. Because if the minister was determined to do it and do it effectively and quickly, she would have put pressure on her bureaucrats to ensure it happened. In fact, when she moved the bill, the amendment bill that would permit the offloading of LIC yesterday, she made it crystal clear that she does not intend to privatize. And it was there in the budget speech she made. Not the budget speech, the speech she made yesterday. She made it crystal clear she doesn't intend to privatize.
But she never said she wanted to privatize. She wanted to disinvest. That's what I'm referring to.
But
disinvestment strategy, not privatization.
The point is, it's not just disinvestment that's involved when you talk of the lack of political will. It's also privatization. This government is committed to privatizing. I believe it is 2 public sector banks and an insurance company, or maybe it's the other way around.
I don't actually know where that's come from, because the government says one thing one day and another thing the next.
Well, that's where it comes from.
It
comes from the government.
What it is committed to, because it has no choice, and what it would like to do is substantially and successfully disinvest, let's say, LIC. That it has not been able to do so, or get rid of this millstone around its neck called Air India. That it has not been able to do so, undoubtedly, is due to severe technical incompetence.
Now, hang on a second. Yeah. It may well be also because of severe technical incompetence. Bureaucrats who are unable to do it, bureaucrats who simply don't understand the manner in which it can be done and won't seek advice from those who do. But at the end of the day, the minister has to exert a measure of political will to ensure it happens, change the bureaucrats if it won't do it, get the advisors who can. Mrs. Thatcher ran up against similar problems in England, and it was her will that pushed it through.
I think that I have said that elsewhere. That's a very important point you're making. There is no political ideology in this government, or for that matter, any government in India's history except briefly Vajpayee ji, that supports privatization other than rhetorically.
In which case, why are you blaming the ministry and not the ministers?
With the idea that this is good for the country because the private sector must be in the business of running business, the government should get out of it. This government is committed to privatization to generate revenues to get out of a fiscal hole.
Yeah, I understand.
It is not an ideological commitment. But that does not reflect lack of political will. When you want revenues, you can get them.
No, hang on a second. It does, because this government has been committed to trying to both disinvest and privatize. And by the way, in May of 2020, when she announced her decisions, she actually made it crystal clear that she was talking about privatization and not disinvestment. A year and 2 months have gone by since May of 2020, and we're seeing nothing in the way of progress. That, to me, is a reflection not just of what you say, technical incompetence on the part of Babus, but lack of political will on the part of ministers. And why are you not blaming ministers? You blame the ministry. Why not the ministers?
Well, because the lack of political will, as you put it, is not correct. It is obvious that if you have a political ideology that, much like they do in many other things, other than the economy, in which privatization is an important component, then you can probably, though not always, I'll give you an example in a minute.
No, don't give me examples. Give me a straightforward
I'm going to give you an example from the Ministry of...
You have a habit of converting a question into yet another question.
I'm going to give you an example. I was personally involved with the Ministry of Finance. The setting up of the National Infrastructure Investment Fund. The political commitment to do it was there. The Minister of State of the time was personally pushing that to the best of his ability. It was purely bureaucratic lack of technical competence and lack of a sense of urgency that meant that it took 3 times the amount of time that it should have taken to set this up. I was directly involved. That is being replicated time and again in each and every privatization. So you can fault the political authority for not having a political ideology that would bring forward privatization as you would the Ram Mandir. But you cannot fault them for putting roadblocks in the way of privatization in the way the finance ministry, bureaucracy and technocracy
having
is.
a political ideology is not a necessary concomitant for having the political will. You can't say because they don't have the political ideology, we can explain away not having the political will.
I'm saying therefore it doesn't mean they don't have the political will.
You're doing that. You're saying that you can excuse the absence of political will on the grounds they don't have an ideology.
I'm saying that
they're only doing it for revenue purposes. And you know what you're ending up doing?
I'm not, I didn't use the word only.
You sound to me as if once again you're absolving the ministers and laying the blame on babus. Once again, you're shying away from identifying individuals and placing the blame on the system.
I do not ever run the business of identifying individuals and not interrogating the system. That's not the business I'm in. And therefore, you'll never get me doing that.
But the longer you keep interrogating the system without identifying the individuals who are the critical levers that make the system work, it sounds as if you're talking in abstractions rather than in terms of practical personalities.
Individuals are not critical levers that make systems work.
That's why I say
it doesn't work that way.
It's not the entertainment industry. That I read may have been a mistake on my part.
It's not an entertainment industry. It's not a cricket team.
Okay. Let's come to your second comment about the finance ministry. And in a sense, when I read it, it was even more devastating than the first.
Which person did you discern I was blaming for this?
I'm going to ask you that. The finance ministry describes ever-changing alphabet-shaped forms of recovery to mask their incapacity to do any serious economic analysis. I want to repeat those last words. To mask their incapacity to do any serious economic analysis. Are you questioning their intelligence or their education and training, or are you questioning both?
Their capacity. Their ability to undertake economic analysis.
Ability presumably is a result or a reflection of intelligence.
No, not just. Also experience, capability, competence.
So my question again, are you questioning their intelligence, their education, or their experience?
It's probably all three. I don't know. I haven't thought about it.
All three?
Probably.
You think that the babus who operate the ministry are incompetent?
At the moment, they're certainly reflecting a large measure of incompetence in that particular field which I happen to know something about.
The babus, I won't name them because you'll shy away from names immediately. No. But can I take their designations? You're talking about people like the chief economic advisor, the finance secretary, the expenditure secretary, the revenue secretary, the disinvestment secretary. All of them lack the intelligence, the experience, and the capacity.
Well, now that you're naming specific offices as opposed to a system, it is clear, I presume, that they don't lack the intelligence. It is also clear, evidently, that their collective efforts reflect a lack of capability. Unquestionably so. And their collective efforts are also childish.
Are they only collectively incapable, or are they individually incapable as well?
I don't think anyone is individually incapable.
But collectively?
To the extent that I would say this person is letting the side down. It's worse than that. The team is collectively, does not seem to be able to come up with the sort of economic analysis that the country in this hour of need demands, yes.
In any other country where this happens, particularly at a critical moment like this when we're going through a crisis, it's the job of ministers to change the team. That's what ministers are supposed to do. That's what CEOs in companies do. When they discover that their directors around them are the wrong ones, they move them around. They get new ones in.
Indeed.
So would you also say that the minister has failed in realizing that her team is incapable and changing it?
You'll have to ask the minister.
No, I'm asking you.
I don't know.
How come you don't know? I'm asking you a simple question. If the people doing critical jobs in the ministry collectively are incapable, those were your words, is it not the job of the minister, A, to recognize it, and B, to change them so that she gets capable people?
Yes.
So it is, therefore, when she doesn't do it, she's failing.
Possibly.
So you agree?
What?
This is a bit like squeezing blood out of a stone.
I'm glad. I hate commenting on people.
I'm simply
but if you're saying that the political authorities have abdicated responsibility,
you're backing away. The boldness, the forthrightness, the courage I identified seems to be missing suddenly when I question you.
I'm so sorry that it goes away the moment you want me to identify people, but like I said, this is not a cricket match. So
it's got nothing to do with cricket matches.
Yeah, if the system and the people manning the system are reflecting substantive incapability, and the government is willing to tolerate that incapability, and the political authorities that run the government therefore transitively are willing to tolerate it, then they are obviously culpable in the generalized incapability.
And should the finance minister in those circumstances have moved to change them?
Whatever she needs to do to raise capability, including changing people, she should have done.
Is that yes or no?
There is no yes or no here.
Well, when you say whatever she needs to do, it sounds to the audience as if you're evading giving a straight answer.
No, she could change the work assignments that she gives them. There are many things you can do. You know.
All right, let's not get into abstractions. It's quite clear that you're not going to actually fully stand by what you.
I stand by every word I've said there, with one exception. I don't do stardust. I don't do entertainment industry. I'm not going to comment on
personalities. This is not stardust and this is not entertainment industry.
When you talk about she should have removed X, that's a person-to-person
How else do I refer to a female finance minister? I can't call him he.
No, if you say that, okay, if you say the finance minister should have removed the permanent secretary, that is not the kind of conversation I want to get into. The finance minister's
But it's a logical conclusion of what you're saying.
If there is lack of capability in the ministry at a collective level, I'm no one to judge which individual should be moved around.
Move them all around.
Government doesn't work that way. You cannot get rid of 5 permanent secretaries in one go.
Let's come to my last question. There is a sentence right at the end of that Business Standard article which clearly refers to the people of India.
Yes.
This is what you write. Are expectations so low? Is insecurity so rife in society that our leaders are rewarded for infantile posturing, empty flag worshipping and chicanery praised as political sophistication?
Yes.
That's clearly a reference to the people of India.
Yes.
What are you saying about them in that sense?
I'm saying the people of India don't seem to have any expectations that the people who they elect will first and foremost improve their collective prosperity. They are willing to be gulled or persuaded that these are too high expectations, therefore low enough expectations, flag waving, chicanery, rhetoric, is enough very often to get people elected.
Does this also mean that the fault ultimately lies with the people of India? They elect these politicians, they elect these governments, and sometimes they re-elect them. So does the fault ultimately lie with the people of India? Is that also something you're suggesting?
I would not use the word fault. I would say that we have to understand why we have such low expectations of our politicians, and therefore why we don't have political movements that are aspirational in nature. And increasingly why our political movements are divisive and accusatory in nature. Perhaps which is why you keep asking me about people. That's a tradition that comes from saying everyone is corrupt. We don't say that anymore. We used to a lot 10 years ago, right? Very low aspiration. I mean, you would expect normally people not to be corrupt.
But coming to the end of this interview, when we did the economic questions at the beginning, we ended with a very bleak black picture, because unless the government has the will to carry through the major reconstruction that's necessary, India will continue in the hole into which it's fallen. And as you said, nothing that the government was saying or doing suggested they'd recognize the problem or had the will to tackle the problem. Now, when we come to the end of the political discussion, everything you wrote in your Business Standard article, and I'm phrasing myself carefully, suggested a similar bleak darkness. But when it comes to the Business Standard article, you're reluctant or unwilling to identify who are the people that make this system happen, because as I keep saying, systems don't exist in the abstract. They consist of people who are the prime movers, and if those people don't change and those people don't accept responsibility, the system will stay. But you don't want to identify any of them. Suddenly, you don't want to say that a description that sounds like the Prime Minister is the PM.
No, I wouldn't.
You don't want to say, when you talk of pusillanimity in response to the crisis, you mean the government. Why?
I don't mean the government.
You mean the system, you said.
I mean the government too. I'm happy to say that. Is the government being pusillanimous? Yes.
I'm so glad you said it now. You were reluctant to say it when I was asking
that question. I do not conflate the government with the Prime Minister. The government is being pusillanimous.
Hang on a second. In every
the government is reflecting incapability.
That is a happy conflation made. The Prime Minister is the government.
You may well make it. I choose not to. The Prime Minister is not, with great respect, the government, and that is the big mistake we make here. In this feudal, personality-driven society, the Prime Minister is an important part of government. The Prime Minister leads government. The Prime Minister is not the whole of government.
Okay.
And the problem is therefore much worse than this or that Prime Minister. It is the government, and I've said in fact there, and it is the government that is pusillanimous because society has become pusillanimous. Yes.
But when we talked about pusillanimity in terms of economic response, you wouldn't put the blame on the finance minister or the prime minister. That you shied away from.
I would put the blame on the government of the day. I've said so. I would put the blame on the Ministry of Finance, certainly. I would put the blame also on the private. You didn't ask me that, but I put the blame in large measure on the lack of ambition of the private sector, certainly. I would put the blame on the geographical divide we have in this country and inequality, certainly. There are many, many things that I would ascribe But I wouldn't talk about this or that individual being the cause of the mess we are in. That I will not do, because that is not true. We are too big for that.
You don't think the Prime Minister has the capacity to change the problems that you're identifying? Because if he has that capacity and his failure to change them, then the blame is his too.
Now, that's a fair question. I do not think the Prime Minister has revealed any such capacity.
That's a pretty damning indictment of him. He doesn't have the capacity to recognize problems. You said that earlier. Now you're saying he doesn't have the capacity to change the attempted solution. In other words, he himself is a bit of a victim.
On track record, it would appear so, yes. I completely agree with you.
Okay. So the picture that faces the country is one of darkness. You don't see anything but darkness down the tunnel. You don't see any light.
I see the rope that will open the curtain, that will let the light in. So the situation is not beyond redemption. But if you don't wish to identify the rope, you don't want to be led to it and you don't want to pull it, then yes, the darkness will continue.
I don't want to be poetic.
Yes.
But if you don't pull that rope, you won't see the light, and therefore you won't dispel the darkness. Could that rope end up becoming metaphorically some sort of noose around the neck of the country?
If you don't see it, then you will end up with far worse fate, extending your poetic analogy to hanging yourself with a rope that could have saved you. Because you'll be stumbling about in ignorance, which we are doing now, and making an already serious and grim situation much worse.
That is the final thing. We're stumbling around in ignorance.
Yes. It is a very depressing thought.
Would that be true of the government? The government is stumbling around ignorantly?
It is true of society. It is true of political forces. It is therefore true also of this. Well, it need not be, you're right. Government could rise above these forces. So yes, you're right. It is true. I'm answering your question.
It is true.
On reflection, yes, it is true.
The government is stumbling around in ignorance.
I don't know in ignorance. It is certainly stumbling around. I hope in ignorance. The alternative is even worse.
Which is?
Malfeasance.
Okay. Let's leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. I have to admit that when I read your article, I saw it as not just a stirring indictment, which it is, but I thought what lay behind it was a forthrightness, a boldness, and a courage. And I have to admit, and I said it to you many times, that to me at least, it feels as if you shied away from that. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Stay safe.